What is up, everybody? Welcome back to part 15 of my John Ferrick book review, Wrecking Crew Demolishing the Case Against Stephen Avery. If you're into the Making a Murderer story, the Brendan Dassey case, the Stephen Avery case, I highly recommend checking out this book. It is filled with a ton of great information. The author talks about way more than just making a murderer in this book as well. You can pick it up on Amazon. That's where I got my copy. Again, if you're into making a murderer, definitely check it out. Definitely check out this book. It is a fantastic read. All right, so what we're doing is we're going over the information that's in the book, the information that was out the time the book was written. A lot of stuff has come out since the book was written, but we are focusing on the information that was available at the time the book came out. John Ferrick wonders if Ken Kratz and Thomas Fassbender initially withheld the CD from Stephen Avery's original trial attorneys because they suspected Bobby Dassey was the killer from the beginning, but then had already reached the point of no return. Talks about how the theory of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey could have been using the computer could not have happened. Stephen Avery was eliminated because he was in jail from November 9th, 2005 onward, and Brendan Dassey was arrested on March 1st, 2006, and he's been in jail since, and things were still searched on the computer after that date. After that, Stephen Avery was already in prison and Brendan Dassey was already in prison. The book talks about how Kathleen Zellner said she visited Stephen Avery one-on-one to discuss Bobby Dassey. Kathleen Zellner states, according to Stephen Avery, Bobby became increasingly obsessed with Teresa Halbach in the few months before her death. Talks about how Scott Tadek has a history of domestic violence. Bobby and Scott have told multiple lies about the events on October 31st, 2005. The police reports state that Bobby Dassey and Scott Tadek went out of their way to try and implicate Stephen Avery into the murder of Teresa Halbach. Scott talked obsessively about the case at work during the investigation. Both Bobby Dassey and Scott Tadek changed their stories to fit the police and state's narrative. They believe Bobby Dassey completely duped the cops, planted the bones and blood to frame Stephen Avery, willingly and enthusiastically became a star witness for the state. Don't forget that Bobby Dassey and Scott Tadek were each other's alibi for the day of the crime. John Ferrick talks about how he believes Scott Tadek helped bury Stephen Avery, a man he hated because he resented the fact that Stephen Avery was in line to collect a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, the $36 million. The book also talks about Kevin Romlo, who came forward in 2017 about seeing Teresa Halbach's RAV4 at the Highway 147 turnaround near the Old Dam Road toward Michoud. Also states there were a few other people that saw the vehicle there as well. Talks about how Kevin states he saw and told Andrew Colburn at the Senex station that he saw Teresa's RAV4. He states that Andrew Colburn was in police uniform. Now, it was supposedly Andrew Colburn's day off. However, the book talks about how he was involved in the biggest investigation of his life. Talks about how Andrew Colburn wanted to run for sheriff. So it is completely unlikely that Andrew Colburn would have taken a day off. And even if he was on his day off, working on his day off, he still could have very well been in his police uniform because that would have given him a bit more authority. Now, I don't know if Scott Tadek still lives at this address, but where the RAV4 was allegedly seen was only a half mile from where Scott Tadek lived in November of 2005. The book talks about how Kathleen Zellner suspects the RAV4 might have been moved from the Old Dam turnabout to the Randit sand and gravel pit Friday afternoon on November the 4th, and then after dark it got towed onto the Avery property where it was spotted the next morning. Stephen Avery states he believes the parking light on the RAV4 was damaged as a result of the towing. They also talk about how Scott Tadek was never fingerprinted or had any DNA testing done. Kathleen Zellner states Scott Tadek should have been tested at the very least to rule him out as a suspect like the rest of the family. Talks about how Scott Tadek is so paranoid he picks up all of his cigarette butts because he's scared somebody is going to pick them up off the ground because he could leave DNA on them. If he's got nothing to hide, why is he picking up his cigarette butts to avoid his DNA getting tested? He wouldn't care. If he's got nothing to hide, allegedly, in my opinion, he wouldn't care if they took his DNA for testing. He wouldn't care if they picked up his cigarette butts. He wouldn't be going through all of this stuff to protect himself. Just my opinion, allegedly, of course. Now, this information comes from a retired Illinois police detective. He also states that the story presented at trial suggesting that Teresa Halbach's body was burned in Avery's outdoor burn pit is preposterous. He stated that the burn pit was almost on top of the garage, and if the flames got as high as Scott Tadek testified at the trial, the entire garage would have gone up in flames. Now, that's not the first time I've heard that. And the propane gas tank would have exploded, causing great damage. It is more likely that Teresa Halbach's body was incinerated inside of a 50-gallon steel drum. Nobody would simply toss the body outside because the weather elements are too unpredictable. The use of a burn barrel would allow the killer to conceal the crime because nobody would see there was a body inside unless they physically walked over to the barrel to look inside. Talks about how Teresa Halbach's body was dismembered and how something like this is obviously very difficult to do, but a hunter would be able to do it. Talks about how Stephen Avery was not an avid hunter, but he talks about how Scott Tadek and Bobby Dassey were hunters, so that is something that they would likely know how to do. Talks about how Teresa Halbach's body was likely dismembered in Bobby Dassey's garage. Talks about how police were notified that a car struck a deer on November the 4th, and that it was the next day the RAV4 was discovered on the Avery property. And when police showed up, there was a deer hanging in Bobby Dassey's garage. They suspect that allegedly Bobby Dassey picked up the deer, hung it, and used it to hide the blood that would have been in the garage from dismembering Teresa Halbach's body. Police never did any forensic examination of Bobby Dassey's garage because they assumed everything in there was from the deer. Talks about how the electronic components of Teresa Halbach were burned in the Dassey burn barrel behind the residence at approximately 4:30 to 5 p.m. Josh Randit indicates he saw a fire at the Dassey residence around that time, though they suspect that's what was going on then. So they talk about what John DeHaan said, and John DeHaan is probably the leading fire forensic expert in the world. He said there was no way that a body was burned in the burn pit. He believes that the body was burned in a barrel and that 40% of the bones were tipped into the burn pit. He says that teeth were missing and teeth never melt. Talks about how if you had burned a fire at the level of heat required at this burn pit outdoors, you would have burned down the entire garage and blown up the propane tank. See, multiple people have stated this. He said you could not sustain the temperature degree for the bones. It is totally fabricated. No body was burned in that burn pit. Talks about the DNA on the hood latch and how the DNA present on the hood latch was way greater than what would have been left if a person just opened the hood latch. Meaning, I touched this, there's a certain amount of DNA left on it, but the DNA that was recovered from the hood latch was way more than if just somebody grabbed it, as if somebody allegedly planted it there. They believe that the 2 groin swabs that were taken from Stephen Avery when they arrested him for a gun charge that were supposedly tossed out were allegedly taken and pocketed, and that's where the DNA on the hood latch came from. Somebody planted that DNA. They talk about the theory of how Teresa Halbach was shot in the head with a .22 caliber bullet, which they found later in Stephen Avery's garage. But they missed it the first bunch of times, the first 6 or so times they searched that garage, and then bam, they suddenly found it, and it's got Teresa Halbach's DNA on it. It states Kathleen Zellner eventually got a hold of that bullet and brought it to the same crime lab that solved the Unabomber case. States it's the best forensic trace lab in the world. Talks about how they found red paint on the bullet and wood and did not have any bones. They talk about how if you shoot somebody in the skull, there would be trace of bones on the bullet. Now the book ends with a tweet from Kathleen Zellner stating it would be so much easier to walk away, close the door, and not spend another dime believing all of the unproven allegations if we could just duplicate the state's forensic evidence. But neither we nor anyone else can duplicate the state's evidence. Why? Because Stephen Avery is innocent. So that's Wrecking Crew by John Ferrick. This is the last video in this series, the book review. I am going to do a couple other videos of stuff that was in the book, but this is the last part of the actual book review itself. John Ferrick's Wrecking Crew, demolishing the case against Stephen Avery. Pick it up on Amazon. Somebody just commented and stated they found a copy on eBay. So anywhere you can purchase stuff online, like books and stuff, have a look. Pick this book up. I highly recommend it. It's a great read. So much great information. If you liked Making a Murderer, pick up this book. I want to thank everybody for sticking with me through these last 15 episodes of this book review. It spanned a very long time, and I thank you for sticking with me from the beginning. I hope you're all having a great day. I'll be back soon with some more videos, and I will see you again soon. Thank you.